Shuru. I'm a TV host based in Kenya, but broadcasting further afield, hosting the show Africa Leadership Dialogues. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning and this breakfast session. And as the mics are checked and switched on, let me just give you a little bit of a context. Now, as the narrative of Africa rising takes hold globally, there's increased focus on African leadership. The greatest challenge facing Africa today is certainly the pressure to deliver on three particular issues. And those are sustainable economic growth, number one, sustainable development, that's number two, transformational development, poverty reduction. And this is a huge challenge for many countries across the continent. Now, during and just after the struggle for independence, Africa saw leaders who made extremely difficult but visionary decisions and political choices, very sacrificial leaders, and they championed the liberation struggle. They forged unity, many of them, in their countries. However, can we say the same of leaders across Africa today? And this is perhaps one of the reasons we are seated here this morning. There are difficult choices to be made. Are our leaders making those choices? So we're live streaming the session this morning, reaching a much bigger audience that we have in here today. And this is all coming under the banner of what is called the Shared Societies Project, run by Club Madrid, which is an organization that has 85 former presidents and prime ministers under its banner. Shared societies simply means inclusive societies, cohesive societies, where everyone's dignity and human rights is respected, where people also have equal opportunities. Now, this project is intended to try to make the case for shared societies using the presidents, former presidents and heads of state, by actually engaging people in discussions of this kind, promoting partnerships, and providing leaders with the right tools. We're hoping this is what will come out of this discussion this morning. So we recognize Club Madrid, but we'd also like to take a moment to recognize the Uongozi Institute based right here in Tanzania. Now, it's a leadership development institute, and for Tanzanians sitting thinking, we know Uongozi very well. For the purposes of those who are guests this morning, let me tell you a little bit more about it. It's housed under the Office of the President of the United Republic of Tanzania, and it's funded by the Finnish government. The focus is research, policy as well, and events of this kind that seek to bring together key decision makers to discuss issues of importance to sustainable development. Thank you very much, Club Madrid and Uongozi, for putting this together for us this morning. Now, with us today, President Olusegun Obasanjo, President Mkapa, and President Festus Mogae. Thank you for making time. We go straight into our discussions. And President Mkapa, I really do want to begin with you. Tanzania, in very many ways, has been able to embrace a unity that is not evident in many other African societies, and maybe is a step ahead of many other countries in terms of shared societies, or the notion of shared societies. And so I ask you, President Mkapa, how did Tanzania achieve this? And what's the importance of it?
Thank you. It's a long story.
I'm making short.
The key, I think, the first key is, of course, leadership. We were fortunate to have a leader with a very, very human perspective in development, a very humanitarian in outlook, very inclusive in consultation. And a party that was really people-oriented, couldn't be going there to the people to seek their opinions, but also to get their endorsement of policies as they were formulated. In addition to that, we have had the lack of having a common language spoken by almost all of the 125 or so ethnic groups or tribal groups in the country. That helped to unite us together. In the first 30 years or so, we had a one-party system of government, and that also helped us to unite. At least it made discussion much easier and less controversial. Over and above the one-party state, we had a parliamentary system that was very regular in seeking renewal of parliamentary leadership, in the sense that elections were held very regularly. That settled minds. Those who were ambitious felt that they could afford to wait, and those who lost felt that it was not the end of the world because there would be another election. So all those things put together built an attitude of mind which was very favorable for consensus seeking. I think I can only do that by an illustration of the way we arrived, for instance, at the Development Vision 2025. Conceptually, it was started by my predecessor and his prime ministers, who are fortunately with us here, Prime Minister John Marechal, Prime Minister Obasanjo. A nationwide discussion, all inclusive, about where we were going and where we would be by 2025. It was necessary because after 30 years of a public sector driven economy, there was clear pressure now for the private sector to be given, or at least to play a much more important contribution to the growth of the economy. One. Secondly, there was more pressure now to contain the emergence of an economic class that would be exploitative in the environment in which we found ourselves, to define the kind of society we kept. Over and above that, we felt that there was a need to change the orientation of people from dependence on the state and the so-called bilaterals and multilaterals to accepting a larger role for self-driven economic transformation. Usually as an MP, you'll be asking, when are you giving us this, when are you giving this? But it was necessary now because of the changes in the world, really, and the paucity of assistance, whether bilateral or multilateral. It was necessary now to change the orientation of the people so that they would grasp the necessity of self-development and self-reliance, which had always been there on our development strategy, but it was not taking enough profile. So out of all that, and coming out of the war with Idi Amin, it was felt that we had to rethink, obviously. And the way to unite the people is to see how we could produce a national development vision. So, as I said, conceptually, it was defined and so on by my predecessors. I decided to carry it forward as extensively as I could. And so, the Planning Commission, which was then under the President's office, was asked to produce a first draft. They produced what we laid it out for discussion throughout the country, all kinds of groups, political parties, all of them. And remember, we had just come out of one party system, but all the political parties discussed this agenda. And all religious groups discussed this agenda. The parliamentarians discussed this agenda. The farmers' associations discussed this agenda. The women and the youth discussed this agenda until we were able, by 1999, to produce what is called the National Development Vision 2025. The advantage of that is that now everyone has participated. No one can say they were excluded. Two, it has elicited a commitment for the realization of those goals set out in there, in critical sectors of growth of the economy. It has elicited a commitment by the population as a whole, and it's very difficult to keep about that. And so now we are left with the task of periodic review of strategy rather than conceptualization or definition or statement of where you want to be 2025. And I think this is the kind of consensus-seeking process, attitude, which has enabled us to stick together, even as the multi-party system has strengthened over the last 20 years. I think this is all that I can say at the time, but there are others in here who are more knowledgeable than I am, and they'll be able to tell us something.
We'll come back to more of that in a moment. And I find it interesting the way President Mkapa makes it seem so simple. This is what we did, and yet when you look at even some of our neighboring countries here, you realize it's never quite that simple. And so let me come to you, President Obasanjo. Shared societies, inclusive societies.
Some of our countries are facing that challenge, and whether it is issues of ethnicity, religion, gender, a multiplicity of issues. In your experience, President Obasanjo, as our nations try to forge more equitable, inclusive societies, what are the greatest internal and external challenges to that?
Thank you very much. You made a statement earlier, and I will go back to that what we saw of leadership in Africa immediately after independence, maybe the quality of leadership had gone down, or maybe the visionary leader that the independence struggle provided may no longer be there. I will not 100% agree with that statement, but I will put it this way, that the independence struggle by itself forged a common purpose. And of course, adversity has a way of bringing up leaders. The adversity of colonialism brought out leaders who struggled for independence, and in the process of struggling for independence also emerged as national leaders, if not national leaders. In the process, those countries that had the law, and I underline that, were able to emerge with an identified national leader that was able, as we have heard from President Mkapa, to forge unity and forge development in the country. My own country, Nigeria, was not that way. Because in the process of struggling for independence, we had three strong regions: the West, the East, and the North. And each of them is big enough to be a country. Not only is each of them big enough to be a country, each of them was ruled by a different political party. Each leader was larger than life within his own region. And in fact, it was not easy for Nigeria to agree to the date of independence. And that was why our independence was a little bit delayed. We started with what they call internal self-governance for the regions. East and West achieved internal self-governance in 1957. The North said it was not ready. And so the North attained independent internal self-governance in 1959. And until each region attained internal self-governance, we could not have an independence for the country. Now, at the time of independence, we Ahmadu Bello in the north. That was a problem that still plagued Nigeria during the war. The people of the West will still romanticize about the time of our war. The people of the East will today still romanticize about the time and period of Nigeria. And so the North. That's one of the reasons why, unfortunately, we have to fight a civil war. So if we now want to start by saying, yes, we have the diversity of religion, diversity of ethnicity, diversity of social strata. Now, the first thing, other than independence, that brought us together is civil war. The fact that we were able to fight a civil war and successfully put Nigeria together. That's the first thing. Now, the next thing that came out of that, or along with that, is the breaking of the country into more states than the three big regions. We initially had 12 states, so that those regions that thought that they were big were broken up, and the states became the instrument or the component units of the federation. I think another thing that helped us, where we are moved a little bit forward, is the fact that our Constitution, as of today, puts certain clauses in it that make for unity. One, it doesn't matter how many votes you have, you must have certain national spread, and that is important. So you do not have a situation where you can carry votes in your state. For instance, 2 of what we call 6 geopolitical zones of Nigeria can almost have 50% of the population, the southwest and the northwest. Between them, they have almost 50%. That you cannot just say you win the votes of the northwest and southwest and you become president of Nigeria. You must have a certain percentage in the rest of the country. Secondly, even in appointing ministers, we have what we now call federal character. And appointing ministers, placing people, recruiting people, they have federal character, which means also that you have to cover the whole country. But I had an unusual experience. And my unusual experience is that normally in Africa and even in Nigeria, your political base is normally your tribe or your ethnic group. When I conducted election in 1999, my tribe or ethnic group of the southwest, which forms 20% of the population of Nigeria, did not vote for me. That's a bit of it. And but I won the election with almost 63% of the vote cast. And that started to change the perception and the situation of Nigeria, that you do not necessarily have to be a tribal leader to be a leader of Nigeria. Because there are those who have tribal background in the past who made the effort and did not make it. And here is and as a BBC commentator said to me, now, what is it that have made it possible for you to lose the vote of your tribe and win the national election? I couldn't answer the question. Maybe these above can help me answer that question. Thank you very much.
Before we leave, you used the word luck, which I will come back to. We will come back to that later, because were some African countries lucky to have a certain kind of leadership or a certain kind of communities, and others less lucky, or is there more to it than that? President Festus, Mogae, I come to you next. And the challenges are many, but some African nations have managed to reach what Donald Kaberuka would call the tipping point rather than a turning point. The challenge then is, in societies, when we do start to build shared societies, to have greater inclusion, how do you ensure a legacy that can stand the test of time in view of all the pressures to change things?
Thank you very much. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stand up because I come from a very small country. Nigeria is the largest country. Tanzania is the largest country in East Africa. In both in terms of... Yes, I am. Why do you think I like sitting?
Please go ahead.
I'm making a virtue of necessity. Well, really, I will admit that in terms of inclusion, shared society, as Botswana, we had less of a challenge than any of the other bigger countries. Partly because, as I've said, we were a small country. We were the poorest, least developed country in Southern Africa, surrounded by relatively developed countries. South Africa, Rhodesia, and now Southwest Africa, now Namibia. Even though there are many similarities between Namibia and us, the fact is that the urban areas of Namibia were developed because they have more white population. That wasn't the case in Botswana. Even our capital was in South Africa, in a town called Mafeking. Well, that's part of colonial history. We don't have time for it. It is also a fact that there are two Tswana states or provinces in South Africa, each of them bigger than the Botswana population. The Northwest Province and the Northern Province, Northern Cape. The Northern Cape Province and Northwest Province are Tswana provinces of South Africa. So even our fellow Botswana in South Africa looked down upon us because we were primitive, not least developed, but underdeveloped. And that's why we didn't have a liberation struggle. When we told the British, hey, we want our independence, they said you can have your desert anytime you want. They said, yeah, we want it. So I always tell my South African cousins, hey, you know what? The reason why you struggle, these guys that developed your countries, big cities, railways, airways, and whatnot, that's why you have to fight. We didn't have to fight for that because when we asked the British, we want independence, they said, you can have it, then we have it. And then we said, okay, what do we do from here? So I think from the very beginning, we felt that we needed each other. We are also, admittedly again, we are relatively homogeneous. I think 80% of the population is one ethnic group, the Tswana group. But of course there is a total of 11 ethnic groups in our country. But there was relative cohesion. But also our traditions as Botswana have consulted. You know, even in our ethnic groups in Africa, some are more dictatorial than others, the traditions. Ours were always very, very consultative. So from day one, partly because we were poor, and partly because it was our tradition anyway, everything we did by consultation. What should we do? What can we do together? So the challenge of discrimination or exclusion wasn't that great. There is one important ethnic group, that is the Basawa, or Bushmen, as they are called. They are very different from all of us. All of us are said to be Bantu. And they are culturally very, very different. But even they were included, but they remain a challenge in their culture. And so, again, I agree with have some luck. Our original leaders were very insightful and visionary. So Mkapa was a friend of Nyerere. But of course, one thing we never did, we never had one party state, and we never labeled our system. And we always had multi-party, and we didn't say we were socialist or capitalist. We just went on saying we are ourselves. But we did do some of the things that Tanzania did. Free education, free health, to the extent that we could afford it, without saying whether it's socialism or capitalism or economy. So that continued that when we discovered mineral resources, again, either out of their visionariness or luck, before the revenues could come, our national leaders, Ratakama and Masire, my immediate predecessor, they went around the country saying that the minerals should vest in the state and the revenues should be used for national purposes. That was necessary because the tribal districts or provinces, now we call them districts now, at that time the revenue, the mineral rights vested in the tribes and their chiefs. So we didn't have to grab them, we consulted them and offered what we would do, and we were able to give consensus. I think it was good, either it was clever of us or lucky, because doing that way, before the revenues actually came, it was easier to be objective, even both on the part of us and the people themselves. I suspect that had we tried to do so later, changing, that would have been a problem. But it wasn't. And then, as a result of that, we promised that the revenues would be used for national development. We then had to agree, again through the same consultative system, that the national priorities on which the revenues will be used. And because we were mostly uneducated, we agreed that education and training, public health and primary health care delivery, provision of water in a semi-arid area, physical infrastructure, including roads, connecting the different regions, were a priority. And incidentally, I was a civil servant for 23 years in the Treasury, Ministry of Planning and so on. Mr. Sua, we know we have met, we used to discuss. So, even in our planning, we produced 5-year development plans, 3-year running, and we would show how each project is funded, showing mineral revenues were accounted for separately so that everybody could see. That is the practice until today. Nevertheless, we did have challenges, for instance, during my time. Two of the most dominant minorities, that they were, especially when South Africa came with 13, is it 13 or 11 official languages? Something like that, including Setswana, of course. So some of other more dominant minorities said, why don't we have a national language as official languages, like in South Africa? We said, hey, but there are only a few of us, we can afford it. But yes, and then they said, the Constitution, Section 77, 78, 79, doesn't mention this one, doesn't mention that one. So I set up a commission, went around for 3 months, produced a report, and many of the MPs were kind of non-committal because they weren't sure how the people would react. But so I made the decision consultatively. It worked. It alleviated that so that that thing died down. The remaining challenge is the Bushmen. I think we have done a wonderful job with the Bushmen because they are scattered all over. We have a Bushman development program, always had, and with the assistance of the Scandinavians. The British, their view was that so long as we leave them in the parks hunting and so on, they have done that for 3,000 years, so you shouldn't bother. But the Scandinavians came and said, no, 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 you say you want a democracy. You have to interfere with their culture. Running around half naked, hunting in the desert is not anybody's culture, it's subsistence. These people cannot be there for the amusement of Europeans when they come and see your animals. So we had to persuade them over time to settle down into settlements because they didn't have villages or settlements. No, they just went all over the place. Now we have 65 Botswana settlements. The children go to school because also the Scandinavians reminded us that education is compulsory, it's a human right, and it uses the Botswana. So I think it's working. However, there is a group of about 1,000 people who have refused. Well, first they agreed to leave a park, a national park, to outside the park. And they have a village, a modern village with school, clinic, everything. And they agreed. But a British NGO called Survival International came and said, no, no, it's wrong, these people are interfering with, it's their culture, the South Kalahari Game Reserve is theirs, and they blasted us in the internet. At that time we were primitive, we didn't know what they are saying about that. We were only told later by others. But anyway, that we are handling that situation. Basically, that's how we have done with cohesion. Really, we do have a tradition, both before and after independence, of consultation. So we are really very inclusive. I myself come from a minority, but a minority that has been in Botswana over 100 years anyway. So I'm a Botswana, so what?
Thank you all for the context. Some very interesting issues raised. I think the whole cultural aspect of the relationship between communities, more consultative communities, more dictatorial communities. In some of our countries, when you hear the word consensus and consultation, some of us develop headaches. So clearly, it might be a cultural thing. I think also the very interesting issue of how do you achieve shared societies and equality and inclusion without creating a tyranny of the minorities. The issue of NGOs has also been raised by President Mogae, the relationship between our governments and non-governmental organizations. How do we make them more productive and constructive? So I'd like to come to a question and answer session. And I think at this point we're really trying to delve, Mr. President, into your personal insights and experiences at the helm. And I want to welcome anybody in this breakfast this morning to ask a question or pose a comment that would help us kind of pull some of those insights out.